with labor, women, and Indigenous people. This is being presented to you by the Centre for International Governance Innovation, which is a think tank based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And we do research on international law and governance, global economics, and global security and politics. My colleague, Hugo Perescano-Diaz, is in the front row and has got materials that I think he's put somewhere just by the entrance. So if you'd like to get some of our publications and some information about other panels that we're doing here in beautiful Argentina at the MC11, please do look at the documents. It's got our program. My name is Oonagh Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the International Law Research Program at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and I'll be moderating this panel. So there's been a lot of discussion at MC11 about how trade can address the Agenda 2030. And it seems to me that the World Trade Organization needs to develop a cohesive vision for the future at MC11, a progressive trade and investment agenda that more equitably shares the benefits of trade and investment by encouraging participation of women and Indigenous peoples so that we can proactively address the impact of digitalization on the right to decent work and facilitate the transition to a green, no-carbon global economy. So how do we make trade more equitable? This panel is going to look at this question. And we find ourselves at a moment of profound change for open societies. While overall poverty levels around the world are diminishing with deepened trade, and we see this particularly in China, but elsewhere as well. And yet at the same time, we see inequality within and across states is at record levels. The benefits of trade do not appear to be evenly distributed, such that many workers consider themselves to be trade's losers, forced to bear the individualized risk of economic restructuring. And women and Indigenous peoples wonder if they will ever really experience firsthand the benefits of participating in international trade. The dawning of awareness of the uneven distribution of the benefits of international trade has stoked fear and cynicism about globalization and calls for more trade protectionism. So how could a progressive trade agenda respond to this? So I have a couple of quotes from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He says, "We need to do a better job of ensuring the benefits of trade extend to the middle class and those working hard to join the middle class, not just the wealthiest few." In short, a progressive trade agenda is not a frill. In addition to being the right thing to do, it is a practical approach. Sorry, just one second. Without which popular support for growth agenda cannot be maintained. So there's some skepticism about a progressive trade agenda, but individual countries are exploring this. There is discussion going on within the NAFTA renegotiations where this is being brought up on the instigation of Canada. So some of the elements of a progressive trade agenda are as follows. Looking for labor safeguards, in a trade agreement, integrating enhanced environmental provisions to ensure that countries do not use environmental protection, weaker environmental protections to attract investment, trying to address climate change and collaborative efforts in that regard, the need for an Indigenous chapter, the need for our agenda chapter, and then also addressing the issue of the right to regulate in relation to investor-state dispute settlement. And finally, looking for ways to help medium and small enterprises in global trade. So one of our panelists today will be speaking more about the idea of including gender chapters in trade agreements, and also the declaration that is being discussed today at MC11. So gender is obviously really important. It's one of the SDG goals. It definitely relates to labor goals as well, the right to decent work. And the idea of including a gender chapter would be really to promote public knowledge and understanding of gender equality. The idea of including Indigenous people's rights or considerations in a trade agreement is also something that is being considered within the NAFTA context on Canada's instigation. And this really derives from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Americas Declaration, both of which talk about the right of Indigenous people to participate in important decision-making that affects their right, and the idea of governments needing to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent. So this panel today will address the perceived mismatch between existing labor provisions in trade agreements and the concerns about the impact of trade on labor and employment, and the need to ensure that global trade is inclusive of women and Indigenous people. The panel will review existing trade agreements and consider the potential to enhance the participation of labor, women, and Indigenous peoples to reinforce progressive social values while promoting global economic growth. It will consider the possibilities and limits for individual states to try to foster progressive trade, and look at how it may best be done in a multilateral setting. It will also consider whether and how regional economic agreements might be sites to rethink distributive justice. And there's a term that Adelle will use, social regionalism, which she will explain. The panel will bring together leading experts on the interface between equality rights, Indigenous rights, labor law, development, and trade to discuss how core social principles of inclusion, equity, and the right to decent work might better be embedded in regional and multilateral economic agreements. So let me now introduce our panelists. And first of all, the order that our presentations will be in, we will begin with Adelle Blackett. Professor Adelle Blackett is the Canada Research Chair in Transnational Labor Law and Development at the Faculty of Law, McGill University, and directs the Labor Law and Development Research Laboratory. She holds a BA from Queen's, an LLB and BCL from McGill University, an LLM and JSD from Columbia University. Next, we will have Alvaro Santos speaking. Alvaro is an adjunct professor. Sorry, I'm just trying to go through my list here. Alvaro Santos is professor of law and director of the Center for Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas at Georgetown University. He teaches and writes in the areas of international trade, economic development, transnational labor law, and the future of NAFTA. So between Adelle speaking about labor rights and Alvaro speaking about development, they will set the stage. Then following them, we'll have Valerie Hughes speaking. Valerie is a CG Senior Fellow and Adjunct Assistant Professor of Law at Queen's University. She's an expert in international trade law and international dispute settlement, and she served as Director of the Legal Affairs Division of the World Trade Organization from 2010 to 2016, and as Director of the WTO Appellate Body Secretariat from 2001 to 2005. After Val, who will speak about gender rights, we will then hear from Risa Schwartz, who will talk about inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights and perspectives in trade agreements. Risa is a sole practitioner focusing on international law and the intersections between trade, environmental law, and Indigenous rights. Risa was formerly a senior research fellow with CG's International Law Research Program, and in that role, she researched law and policy that supported increasing Indigenous peoples' participation in international law and treaty making. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Adelle.
Great.
Thank you.
Oh, I think. Yeah. So sorry, I'm going to have to scroll a little bit, but we should. Oops. It was there before.
sorry.
I'm not sure if my presentation is still there.
There it is.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. This one? Okay. Not go backwards? Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, thank you very much. Thank you to CG, to Oonagh, and Hugo for the invitation to, think about this panel and to national level as an appropriate level for addressing labor and the social dimensions of labor. And third, premise is that trade builds communities of exchange, and through those communities of exchange, one can begin to reimagine how trade can be built to include a social dimension. So first, the mismatch. And here I'm going to just start with an image which somehow speaks louder than the words. We pay attention in trade, of course, to the way in which goods move across borders. Increasingly, and of course there are more troubling images, people move too, but they move bearing the risks of that movement. They move often with great precarity, and yet labor is understood as one of the factors of production in trade, and so much of what we're thinking about are the conditions. Second image, similarly the geography. And in the process of presenting this image, I present some work that CG supported by one of my colleagues at McGill, Armand de Métral. And his work, like the work of many others, is rethinking the way in which we have imagined the landscape for international investment. So we accept that investors through investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, seek to reduce the risks that they face when they engage in international commerce. And we've built a rules-based system in many jurisdictions, including my own with the incoming CETA agreement, to address this issue. But the issue of whether, especially in states with well-functioning judicial systems, this is the most appropriate way to approach this matter, is increasingly on the table. And we know the examples of the states that have called this into question, including South Africa, Australia. What I want to focus attention on are other actors who bear risk. So risk is not simply neutral, right? And one of the claims that we're increasingly seeing after over 20 years of experimenting with labor dimensions to trade is that workers are making a very different kind of claim. And that is the claim that they feel, for any number of reasons, right? It's not all trade, and we know that technology in particular is one of the structural changes that affects the way that the labor market develops in different contexts. But there is a recognition that with particularly economic policies that discourage states from taking on a greater social protection role, from shrinking their social protection mandate, that workers individually are being asked to bear the risk of globalization. And so, not surprisingly, and there's not much to be said here, and we're not going to draw an immediate causal link, but populism has been allowed to occupy a space in part because we've not taken the time both to explain the importance of open economies, but much more fundamentally taken the opportunity to use open moments of contestation to rethink some of the architecture that would allow some of the risk that individual workers are being asked to bear individually. One of the reasons a social dimensions approach to trade, and in particular to regional agreements, was emphasized, was a concern to distinguish between protectionist uses of trade and a more development-focused approach to improving labor conditions in developing countries with whom we would be entering into trade agreements. And not only has experience with those agreements shown that the questions are not only in developing countries, they're in countries of the global north where conditions need to be addressed, but that this is only one side of the image or the equation. And so the focus on social protection, in particular, the claim for jobs in the event of dislocation that is induced by trade, remains and largely remains unanswered. One of the things that was emphasized by a number of speakers in this TSDS over the last 2 days is the importance of social adjustment measures. And I'm going to be turning to that quickly. What I do want to stress, though, is that in the very few examples that the only example really that we have of an actual case addressing the social dimensions, one of the key sticking points was that the need to establish that there was a matter affecting trade. And I'd like us to focus attention on whether, if we need to really turn attention to that question, our social dimensions approach is actually dealing with how trade and labor are truly linked. My colleague Alvaro Santos is going to be speaking more specifically to the different elements in trade agreements that are currently largely present, to which we should be turning attention as a labor matter. And I will note that yesterday in this session there were some very interesting suggestions, in particular around rules of origin. What I want us to turn attention to is to thinking through why it is that the emphasis is still placed on thinking about labor at the domestic level. Are we engaging in a level of methodological nationalism that no longer meets the appropriate governance level at which much of labor is being reorganized or re-understood? And here I draw very much on Karl Polanyi's work on embedded liberalism, John Ruggie's term really, but recognizing that social rights were embedded in individual domestic economies at the post-war period on the understanding that we would be able to liberalize progressively beyond states if the redistribution happened within states. John Ruggie has also emphasized that, of course, individual states in this developing country, for the most part, were never able to afford that same luxury of the redistribution internally, and that is increasingly under question now. And so attention then turns to the distributive dimensions that are reflected in the division. So we think about trade as transnational. What is it that stops us from thinking about labor, and in particular levels of representation that would address labor at the transnational level? And here I'm building very much on Nancy Fraser's framework. I would like also, though, to suggest that this isn't only a new way of thinking about how to govern labor. There were past understandings that labor could and indeed should be thought about as in an integrated fashion and in an interdependent fashion via international institutions, including what would have been initial or an initiative to build an international trade organization through the Havana Charter in 1948, and where the relationship between employment and trade was intimately understood. I'll mention as well where the relationship between the United Nations and the trade architecture was deeply understood. For a variety of reasons, of course, we do not have that interface, though I have been intrigued over the last couple of days to listen to the extent to which the social development goals were being emphasized as a way to bring back something that we understood in the immediate post-war period. So to conclude on my third dimension, let me emphasize that regionalism, to the extent that this is an open moment, and I have been struck by at once the deep urgency and concern expressed by participants in MC11, but also the sense that there is a need to stop and have dialogue. To the extent that this is an open moment, I would suggest that we should be thinking about multiple governance levels at which we can think about social protection without protectionism. I set out very briefly here different forms of adjustment. There's a lot written about adjustment measures at the domestic level. My suggestion here is that we need to be thinking about adjustment across a range of government or governance levels. We should not be assuming that the domestic is necessarily the only and the best level at which to think about adjustment, but we should be thinking instead about regions as possible spaces through which to think through the ways in which social protection without protectionism can be delivered. And in this, I want to recall, frankly, what was raised just in the previous panel about the importance of moving beyond a language of convergence to thinking about interdependence of international organizations and their ability to speak to one another. The ILO, I would argue, an old 1919 international organization about to celebrate its centenary, but that seemed to understand immediately the space.
I want to use the case of TPP to illustrate that. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was composed of 12 countries on the Pacific lines, both on Asia and the Americas. And when the United States was still a part of that, it was tantamount to 40% of the world's GDP. So there's a question about whether now, without the US, TPP will actually continue or could come to fruition. But I want to contend that regardless of what happens to TPP, what we're seeing now is the increased attention to mega regional orderings, whether it's TPP or TTIP, the agreement between the US or Europe, or CETA between Canada and Europe, or RCEP in Asia. So what you see now is that the global rules for trade are being designed and agreed in a sort of patchwork in different sorts of arrangements, and that the multilateral fora of WTO doesn't seem to be, and it doesn't seem likely to become again the main fora where these rules are basically agreed upon. The WTO continues to be relevant, particularly for dispute settlement. There is also a lot to pay attention to in the way that trade rules are being interpreted. They'll have impact in these other organizations. But I would say at the moment where countries are organizing themselves to try to figure out how to redesign the rules of global trade, it's in these other areas. And so there is where I think we need to pay attention to, going back to Adelle's call for regionalism and sort of what is a regional, social regional alternative. All right, so here just a few points about how TPP was sold. A very sort of the gold standard of that type of liberal globalization that we had seen. It included things like digital trade, a labor and environmental chapter, stronger IP protections. You can see this. Things that hadn't really been regulated in the same way in the WTO. All right, so here's the labor chapter, and I'm going to spend now a little bit of time telling you what was included in the TPP in terms of labor standards, and then what are the critiques of those labor standards. And then I'm going to move to telling you what other areas of trade we can think of that might be more relevant if we want to address those questions of distribution that I put up on the slide at the beginning. And so here, I started this project with a puzzle, which was, why is it that despite having the most robust labor chapter ever in the history of trade agreements, the labor movement and labor organizations in the United States oppose it so vehemently? They wrote a very critical report where they basically criticized the labor chapter, and at the end they were opposed to the TPP. So you would expect that if we follow basically the progression of how labor chapters, how trade agreements have dealt with labor standards, unions and the labor movement would be happy. This is basically a successful progression. So you can see here from NAFTA, the first agreement that included labor, all the way to TPP. And so both in terms of substantive rights, in terms of procedural rights, and in terms of enforcement, and TPP is much more robust than anything that's come before. So here you can see it's a little cut, but you still can see. So the five fundamental rights as declared by the ILO in the Declaration of Fundamental Rights. So you have them there: freedom of association, collective bargaining, prohibition against forced labor, prohibition against discrimination, and prohibition against child labor. NAFTA included just a requirement for countries to comply with their own labor regulations. So it was a reference to countries' own domestic regulation. Here in TPP, you have international standards as recognized by international organizations. Then TPP also added a few other things. For instance, the requirement to adopt acceptable conditions of work, so minimum wage, hours of work, health and safety. Also, that parties shouldn't derogate from labor rights in special economic zones, and that they should discourage the importation of goods produced with forced labor. So these are all, some of them innovations from TPP, some had been included also in the previous trade agreements. In terms of dispute settlement, whereas NAFTA's dispute settlement was really incredibly weak, and it wasn't, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, in NAFTA, there was a labor side agreement. It wasn't really part of the main agreement. In TPP, all these provisions are part of the main treaty. The same with the dispute settlement. Here you have now a recourse to dispute settlement in the main agreement, and you have remedies, which include trade sanctions, right? So just as in other areas of the TPP, you can make a complaint, and eventually, if you win the case, you can basically impose trade sanctions against the violating party. So in all these areas, you know, the substantive labor standards, the procedural mechanisms that allow you to bring a complaint, and then in the type of enforcement mechanisms with the trade sanctions, TPP is by far the most developed labor chapter. Okay, so what were the critiques of it? Well, so the labor organizations weren't happy that the reference is still to the ILO declaration. They wanted the text that comes from the specific conventions, which is clearer and has been interpreted by the ILO in multiple documents and reports. They also mocked the way in which some of these requirements were still very much depending on the willingness of parties to comply. So, for example, the adopting and maintaining acceptable conditions of work was still, the level of compliance was still left to the parties they contended. So parties determined whether and how they were complying themselves with these laws. And so in that sense, it seemed to me to be to them a very weak requirements. The requirement to discourage the importation of goods produced by forced labor, they said, well, you know, this sounds very good, but a party can just discourage the importation of goods from forced labor by posting, you know, a poster discouraging the importation of goods, you know, made with forced labor. So they were obviously leading this to the absurd, but just to show you that the requirements were actually weak and that there was really no way to enforce some of these additions. And then finally, in terms of enforcement, well, they were insisting on how difficult it was to enforce one of these cases because you still need the state to represent you, and states, you know, drag their feet. They've been unwilling to bring up cases. And then when we had the decision that Adelle referred to between the US and Guatemala, that decision still found that despite having been a systematic violation of labor rights, it wasn't in a matter that affected trade, because basically the labor violations didn't give a competitive edge to the party that was violating, again, its competitors in trade. And so the interpretation seems very, very hard to allow a case to win. And they were basically saying the standard is incredibly high and it will never really work. So basically, the point here is enforcement is hard. But even if you were to manage, this is I think the main point. Even if you were to manage to have, you know, really tight labor rights and a better enforcement system, you know, with better ways to enforce that, it would still be probably insufficient. Why? Well, because there are other areas of trade agreements that might be much more relevant to workers in terms of trying to avoid job losses and wage stagnation. And here, basically, I think the important point is to realize that the promise that started with NAFTA, the illusion that by including labor chapters in a trade agreement, you were going to be able to, in some ways, curtail the competitive edge of developing countries in using cheap labor. That is what some people refer to as social dumping because of labor violations. And that basically having a labor chapter would prevent job losses in developed countries. It's an illusion. Even if you manage to enforce these labor chapters, the differential in labor costs will remain such that you will still have the pressure of, you know, outsourcing and job losses. And so I think that labor chapters could be good to avoid forms of labor exploitation in developing countries. And I think in that sense, the labor chapters could be useful. I'll say a little bit more about it in a second. But from the point of view of the North and labor organizations and unions in the North, the idea that the labor chapter is what's going to prevent, in some ways, these pressures for jobs to go abroad, I think it's now clear, and they've realized it's not going to work. So what are other areas of trade agreements that might be more promising? Well, they actually developed these ideas and pointed out that in trade agreements there are areas that might be much more relevant to workers. For example, rules of origin. So now in the renegotiation of NAFTA, you see that a big part of the debate is what's going to be the threshold? What percentage of origin do you require in the trade agreement? Because that's going to determine how much content from the region you require for the goods to be treated with duty-free. Government procurement. So can governments use government procurement, which in the case of rich countries, it's up to 35–40% of GDP. can you use that as a way of job creation and fiscal stimulus, particularly in forms of crisis, for which you would need to discriminate against foreign goods, basically. So the labor movement is saying there's a way in which we can use government procurement to try to promote jobs domestically. Investment. So, and here the point is, the treatment that we've given in trade agreements to investors is unlike other treatment that we've given anywhere else in trade agreements, because it goes beyond national treatment. And we've given them a private right of standing. And so there's a very asymmetrical treatment of investment and labor. And they worry that this is curtailing the regulatory space of states in environment, in health, but also in labor. There was a recent case by a French company in Egypt suing Egypt because of a minimum wage law. And so the idea here is, can we then rebalance the treatment that we're giving investment vis-a-vis labor, either by scaling back the way we treat investment or ramping up the way we treat labor? Some scholars have actually then proposed that we should give workers and labor organizations private rights of actions in some ways, or treat them in a similar fashion as the way we treat investment. And finally, they've also pointed out currency manipulation as an area of trade that has great bearings on, you know, what happens to trade competition and therefore to workers. So I think that if we were to think about how can we design trade agreements that could be more responsive to these concerns, these trade concerns, focusing on the labor chapter is not going to be much. It's not going to do much, to be blunt. At least not much for workers in the north. I still think that they could be helpful for workers in the south, particularly in the negotiation process. So one of the things that happened with TPP that it's not very noticed is that as a result of the negotiations and the pressure in the negotiations, Mexico, for instance, changed its constitution to allow a domestic labor law reform that independent unions had been asking for years, which included changing the dispute resolution system, which is currently dominated by the government, the employers, and the official unions, and moving that to the independent judiciary. Or getting the registration of unions from the government and into an independent institution. So there's a way in which countries can take advantage of the negotiations, even when they're negotiating labor chapters, to try to improve situations in the South as well. So my initial question, are labor chapters useless? No, I think that they can perform an important role, so long as we're conscious that they're not going to do what was once thought they could do and what people sometimes refer to in a way to justify the continuation of liberal globalization as we know it. So I think that I agree with Adelle that the thought shouldn't be just thinking about domestic changes and domestic regulations. There's a lot to do at the international level, but we need to retool or reconceptualize what we mean when we think about the international rules. And currently, it's common to think that if we care about labor chapters is the place to pay attention to. And I would say we need to reorient the way we think about labor at the international level as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alvaro. And now we'll turn to Valerie Hughes to discuss gender and trade.
Thank you, Oonagh. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, CG, for the invitation. It's a real delight to be here. Trade and gender. So I talked to a couple of people, and I mentioned I was going to talk about trade and gender. And couple of people that are senior trade experts, and they looked at me and said, yeah, what is that? What does it mean? What's it about? Well, what it's about is understanding that trade policies and trade rules affect men and women differently. That's the essence of what it's about. And so if you understand that, then you govern yourself accordingly when you are crafting trade policy and when you're drafting trade rules. So the idea here is to raise awareness about what trade and gender means when you are acting in an important role of crafting trade policy and drafting trade rules. Use a gender lens when you do that, and you will achieve gender-neutral policies and rules. And so the next thing is, well, now that you tell me what it is, why? Why should we do it? Well, Oonagh mentioned that the Prime Minister of Canada says it's the right thing to do, but besides that, it's also important because the participation of women has positive effects on economic growth. I'm not making this up. Maybe some other people made it up, but I read that stuff, and that's what economists say. It has a positive impact on economic growth. And as the Canadian Trade Minister says, why play soccer with half the team on the bench? So how do trade policies affect men and women differently? Well, if you think about Cambodia, 86% of the employees in the silk industry are women. So if you do something in your trade policies about textiles, you're going to affect those women. You think about women being the majority of workers in import competing industries like textiles, like footwear. So when you do something in your trade policies or your trade agreements dealing with footwear and textiles, you are affecting women more than men because they're more involved than men. Women are traditionally in the services sector. That's the sector that's usually less liberalized than the goods sector. Temporary entry agreements. Which professions are you outlining in your temporary entry? Are they mostly occupied by men or by women? Men tend to be employed in traditional export sectors, natural resources, for example. So when you're doing trade policy, you have to think that you will be affecting men more if you're addressing these elements in a trade agreement. Women produce 50% of the global food products and comprise 43% of agricultural labor force in developing countries. So when you're talking to have women working because they're at home taking care of children. So these are the ways that trade policies affect women more than men, differently from men. And what's behind all this, of course, is we have to remember the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 5 is achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. You remember what the Millennial Development Goals said in 2000. That said, promote gender equality and empower women. Now, we're told, and we've all agreed across this world, that we're going to achieve gender equality. So we have to step it up. And so what do we do? How do we address trade and gender? Well, in some places, we do it through trade agreements. Some say, well, no. This trade and gender stuff, yeah, you know, we'll promote women and make sure that they have an equal place in society, and we'll address equal pay and all kinds of social safety nets, but we're not going to do that in a trade agreement. It doesn't belong there. Good heavens. And other people say, well, you know what? It's a place to start the conversation. And as long as you're talking about it in the context of negotiating trade agreements, then maybe the Sustainable Development Goals might be a little easier to address and achieve. So Canada, together with Chile, has a trade agreement that includes a trade and gender chapter. We negotiated the trade agreement with Chile 20 years ago, but this year we updated it and we changed a few things. And one of those things is that we added a trade and gender chapter. So Canada very proudly says in all its newspapers, and our Liberal government very proudly saying, we're the first G20 country to do that. But we weren't first. Uruguay and Chile had a trade and gender chapter in their FTA before we ever got around to it. So, okay, so we're second. That's good enough. So what's in there? What's in this chapter? Well, there's a lot of general provisions that acknowledge that the importance of a gender lens in crafting trade policy and in making trade rules. And there's a lot of cooperation activities that we're going to do. And we created a trade and gender committee with people from both countries on it. And it's interesting because people are saying, well, yeah, but what it says in the trade and gender chapter is that dispute settlement doesn't apply. So what's the point? It's all fluff, you know. Well, interestingly, what it says is cooperative activities shall be carried out on issues and topics agreed upon, blah, blah, by government institutions, labor unions, research organizations, NGOs, shall be carried out. That's strong language. So I don't really think it's a problem that we don't have a dispute settlement chapter applicable to the trade and gender thing. What are you going to do? Take them to court if they don't establish a committee? I mean, that's not the point here. The point is what it says. And it says cooperative activities shall be carried out. And these cooperative activities are all kinds of them. Capacity building, skills enhancement, improving women's access to education in science and math and business and engineering. Lots of activities sort of promoting women on corporate boards, advancing care policies with a gender perspective. One of the very important elements of this is the Trade and Gender chapter calls on Canada and Chile to share methods for collecting sex disaggregated data. Because one of the problems is that we don't have a lot of sex disaggregated data. And it's not just how many men are in this industry and how many women work like that. It's also about gender issues such as unpaid work. Those kinds of things are called for in the Trade and Gender chapter. We have to cooperate and share data, share the analysis. Lots of activities in terms of exchanges of knowledge and collaborative research also. So I think, you know, that's one element. This is one way of doing things. Canada and Chile have decided to do it that way, and Canada is trying to bring this to other fora. There's also the Buenos Aires Declaration that we've heard about. We've got a group of members that have been working on this declaration on trade and gender, and apparently, perhaps at this moment, being adopted by, I'm told, the other day they were expecting about 130 WTO members to sign on. Now, when you consider that we only have 164 members in total, that is a fairly impressive number. And there's Argentina, there's Canada, there's Kenya, there's Sierra Leone, there's, you know, members from across the globe that have been working on this. I don't know who signed on to it yet. We'll find out a little bit later, but it's not just a certain region, it's not just a certain development angle. It seems to be the diversity that is important. And what does that declaration do? Well, we will see later what it does, but what I understand it does, an early draft of it talks about the importance of incorporating a gender perspective in the promotion of economic growth, and it talks about how trade policies contribute to advancing gender equality. So the people that say, well, trade doesn't belong, like trade and gender doesn't belong in a trade agreement, this thing says actually it does. It really does advance gender equality when you include this kind of, these kinds of statements and acknowledgments in trade agreements. And it acknowledges that removing barriers to women's participation in international economies contributes to economic development. So it's also good for the bottom line. So another thing is about sharing experiences, and one of the ideas is that that was in an earlier draft. We'll see if it's in the final one. Is there was a suggestion that on a volunteer basis, members could in their TPRMs at the WTO identify what they're doing in terms of trade and gender. So sharing of information and you know, giving an opportunity for members to identify what they're doing to remove economic barriers for women. Also talks about gender disaggregated data. So I know that we're running late, so I'm going to end it there. I just want my final statement is that I don't know what the value of a declaration is. There are appellate body decisions that address the legal value of a declaration, but if you have 130 members signing on to it, it must mean something. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Val. Thanks for that, Val. And now, finally, we turn to Risa Schwartz, who will talk to us about an even more challenging question, and that is inclusion of Indigenous people in trade agreements.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Oonagh, and thank you, CG, for inviting me to this panel. Unlike the trade and gender issue, if Canada is actually successful getting a trade and Indigenous peoples chapter in NAFTA, it can claim to be the first. So this is one of our newest innovations in Canada. And it all begins this summer, August 14th, 2017. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, introduced Canada's negotiating priorities for the renegotiation of NAFTA, which has the name of NAFTA 2.0. And one of those priorities was having a trade and Indigenous peoples chapter in NAFTA. And why? We heard from Val, there's good economic reasons for trade and gender. There's also good economic reasons for an Indigenous peoples chapter. Especially for Canada, it's Canada's fastest growing population. The 2016 census shows that Indigenous people are now 4.9% of the national population, but this is a great increase. And in fact, as many developed countries, the birth rate has slowed down in Canada, but it hasn't amongst First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So we're just going to see a larger growing population. They're our youngest population. Why a Trade and Indigenous Peoples chapter now? It has a lot to do with the Trade and Gender chapter in the Chile-Canada agreement. It gave a good precedent to build upon, opening up trade agreements to trying to be more inclusive of groups in society that have historically been left out of trade. And as well, why is Canada bringing this forward? Well, this is consistent with Canada's constitution. Section 35 of Canada's constitution recognizes First Nation, Métis, and Inuit rights, and that was in 1982. But it's also Canada's taken a major step forward, and this is, I think, ending with Valerie's question, what is the value of a declaration? Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Canada's working on implementing it into laws and policies of the country. So there's some consistency with that as well. I'll go very quickly through this, but there's been, I think it's been probably the last 3 years, there's been quite a tremendous change in Canada towards the recognition that Indigenous peoples have historically been really left out of society, our society in Canada. And there's been a lot of stories, especially with residential schools, that have been hidden, have been taught to young Canadians. Personally, went to school in Canada in the 80s and 90s. Didn't learn about Indigenous people in great detail, and in fact, actually a focus more on the Inuit but on things that were stereotypical, like the building of an igloo, rather than the understanding that there was residential schools until I think the last one's closed in the 80s, but really it's a policy that started laying down in the 1950s and 60s, but where children were taken away from their families in order to assimilate them into Canadian society, and this has caused great hardship to the continuation of culture. So we're coming to terms with that, and that started with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was, I think, a 3 or 4 year cross-Canada inquiry, listening to the survivors of residential schools, hearing their stories, and it came with 94 calls to action at the end, with recommendations, and 6 of those talked about the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation in Canada. And some of the things I'll just point out quickly is the support that Canada has given for now the implementation of this declaration into Canadian laws and policies. They've set up a working group of ministers, and this working group will focus on whether Canada's current laws and policies are consistent with Section 35 of Canada's Constitution and international law agreements such as the UN Declaration. And Canada just gave support for Bill 262, and that's given second reading just last week, and that is a bill that is looking at more of the, it's more of a reporting of how the UN Declaration is being implemented in Canada. So it's a step towards implementation. So why is a Trade and Indigenous Peoples chapter important? And there's three reasons really why bringing this chapter really is a new innovation that will be helpful for Indigenous peoples. One is the adding of preferences. So NAFTA is quite an old agreement. It's 1994, and there are some newer preferences in trade agreements signed with Europe, CETA, and in the draft TPP that grant more favorable status to and treatment to Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal peoples is the term the Canada's Constitution uses to talk about Indigenous peoples. So procurement, right now, there are in individual provinces and in Canadian policy procurement advantages for Indigenous peoples, but NAFTA doesn't recognize that, so that needs to be brought in. As well, state-owned enterprises, there's a clause in the TPP that allows for benefits for Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples, and that also should be moved into NAFTA. Importantly, there's a need to protect treaty and Aboriginal rights in NAFTA. There are some protections already, but they're not sufficient. And probably the most important reason for having the actual chapter is to increase trade for Indigenous peoples in just the sense of increasing opportunities for trade in Canadian society, but also developing internation or intertribal trade, where Indigenous peoples can trade amongst each other more freely, which is something that there's been some groups that have been promoting. All right. Is it dead? Oh, good. So also, why is Trade and Indigenous Peoples chapter important? One is really a process. So the process of establishing the chapter, there has been much more consultation with, and I'm going to use the word actually engagement because it hasn't met our constitutional level of consultation. But there certainly has been much more engagement with Indigenous peoples in Canada while developing this draft chapter for introduction. And Canada set up an Indigenous Peoples Working Group, which involves all the national governance organizations from First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, but also stakeholders from Aboriginal businesses across Canada and our modern treaty holders. Modern treaties are newer treaties in Canada that have a lot more self-governance, and they're representing themselves in the Indigenous Working Group. Substance. Canada is a trading nation, so it is important in order to really start achieving reconciliation. It can't just be reconciliation on social issues. There has to also be economic reconciliation as well, and in fact, that's probably the most important. So we're looking at reconciliation in an international trade agreement. And finally, our precedent on international law. This is and Oonagh actually read out the language from Article 19 of the UN Declaration in the introduction, but it's about participation of international law. Oh, and the Indigenous Peoples chapter was introduced in NAFTA in round 5 in Mexico City. That just happened in November. So it was a draft was provided to the other parties, Mexico and the United States. And so that draft will be under discussion in round 6 in January in Montreal. So what are the elements of a draft Indigenous Peoples chapter, the chapter that was proposed to the other countries? One, rights recognition. So the recognition internationally of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was a declaration that was adopted by all countries in the world, except for actually Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. But those 4 have come around and changed their views on the UN Declaration. So that would be recognized in the chapter. Participation of Indigenous peoples directly in the chapter. So similar to the Trade and Gender chapter, a committee is being proposed, but this committee would have Indigenous representation as well as representation from government. So that's actually quite a big difference, and I understand will be something that will be debated with the other countries that are NAFTA parties. promotion of economic opportunities. So the idea, of course, of promoting options and opportunities for trade within the chapter. And there's also a special emphasis, because Canada also has an emphasis on gender as well. Currently, we're going through an inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women. One of the reasons that the interim report noted that poverty is a big reason for why many women in Canada are falling through the cracks and literally going missing and being taken from us. So there is a real emphasis also on promoting opportunities for Indigenous women in the draft chapter. Similar to the discussion we just had about the labor chapter, it just can't be an Indigenous peoples chapter. There has to be issues throughout the NAFTA and throughout trade agreements looking at rights, because a chapter alone is not going to solve the problem. So I discussed the preferences for Aboriginal businesses. Those would probably be not found in the chapter themselves, but found in exceptions to NAFTA that would allow for these preferences to continue. The labor chapter and the gender chapter would also make reference to Indigenous peoples. Labor, it's the Sustainable Development Goal 8, which talks about decent work, and that specifically has been important for Indigenous peoples. So a mention of that should be made. The environment chapter is key to First Nations in Canada. I'm going to finish this slide. So the environment chapter is key to this because it the land and resources for Indigenous peoples in Canada, that's a key, and so the protection of that, but also the recognition of that climate change has been much more impacts on Indigenous people, especially the Inuit in the north. So any climate change references in the NAFTA should note the impacts on Indigenous peoples, but also note that the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples could be used as a tool to help us adapt to climate change. There also is a proposal going forward for human rights impact assessments with a focus to how NAFTA would impact Indigenous peoples. And most importantly, having a general exception that would protect treaty and Aboriginal rights. So a large carve-out for treaty and Aboriginal rights in the NAFTA. So I had more to tell you, but I'm told I have no time, so I will stop there.
Okay. Thanks very much, Risa. So we have about 5, yes, thank you very much, Risa. Risa, thanks for introducing this very important topic into the conversation. So I would like to give you a chance in the audience, if you have any questions, to pose them to our panelists so they can react. Anyone like? Yes? Please state your name and...
Hi, my name is Henry Wang, Huiyao Wang, and I'm from Center for China Globalization, so we know CG quite well. And well, my question would be regarding the TPP, because now you see the Japan and Australia now they're trying to reactivate the TPP now, and but the TPP without U.S. or without China, would that really be? You think you're going to go ahead? And also my second question would be. You know, now we have TPP, we have RCEP, we have all the TTIP, and so what's the future of WTO then? If all the proliferation of all those regional trade agreements flourish, and then would that be an impact on the multilateral like WTO? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Before we answer it, I just want to see if there's another question. Maybe take one or two more. Yes, please. The mic.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Molina. I'm from Ecuador, and I have a question. It's like, what's the role of trade agreements and what can it do for the problem of urbanization and the rural areas development?
Okay. Is there one more question? Yes, behind you, and then we'll give everyone a chance to answer very quickly.
Good afternoon. My name is Gayatri Kant, and I represent Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. My question is to Ms. Hughes. You spoke of specific activity-based industries where women's where policies should be women-specific. For example, you spoke of food and agriculture, care and elderly care, child care and elder care, textiles. So don't you think you risk stereotyping these sectors as women-specific by having just very proactive women-related policies instead of having gender-neutral policies? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just take 1 minute each, because I know we have to kind of keep things on schedule. Should we start off with you, Alvaro?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
My pleasure. So, two very easy questions, the future of TPP and the future of the WTO. So I can't say with confidence what's going to be their future. The TPP might be reactivated, and if that's of interest to the member parties, then it might work. I think that the relevant thing to notice here is the way in which countries are finding ways to redesign or write new rules according to their interests, and that might not be the multilateral forum, right? So regulating new issues or re-regulating issues that they care about. And so it might well come into life without the United States. And now the question is, for the future of the WTO, I think the WTO will subsist and continue. I'm not that nostalgic about the WTO in terms of the preferable forum for negotiation. I think that we've seen how hard it's been to reach consensus on a number of issues there, and so I think that the question is, what are the relevant fora that are open for reimagining and redesigning the rules of trade? And if we can find models in some of these regional organizations, then I think we should use them. Can I just say one more thing very quickly? This goes back to Adelle's slide of the container and then the boat with the migrants. There's a way in which thinking about trade and labor, or trade and gender, or trade and indigenous peoples, make it look like we're talking about things that need to be accommodated, that are sort of minority rights. But in fact, you're talking about most of the world's population when you're talking about workers, and half of the world's population when you're talking about women. And so there's a way in which this calls for really making this a much more integral part of the way we think about trade, rather than confining it, and the same with indigenous rights, confining it to specific chapters, or dealing with this in a very specialized way. And so I think this is a moment that's ripe for reimagination. I hope that we can figure out a way to do that.
Thank you, Alvaro. Risa, would you like to comment?
Sure. I'm also going to comment on the same question. I think this TPP does give, because it does look like it is going to be possibly renegotiated, and I'm quite excited about that, because we can build upon the work, Canada can build upon the work it's doing with NAFTA and start looking at Indigenous peoples there as well. There are 300 million Indigenous peoples around the world, so it's an issue that's not just a Canadian issue. It's something that I'm hoping can be discussed in places like the TPP and at the WTO.
Thanks, Risa. Val?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think what the idea is to be mindful of the gender impact when you're preparing trade policy and when you're drafting trade rules. And so the idea is to be gender neutral as you use that lens. Where you have to be specific about women is when you have to remove the barriers that exist, like, for example, access to financing, ownership of business, opening a bank account. We know that there are many nations in this world that prohibit women specifically. So that's where you have to get specific about women. So I think there's room for both.
Thanks, Val. Adelle, last word to you.
Great. So just want to say how pleased I am to be in a conversation that is taking seriously the fact that this is a moment where we're searching, right? And I'm struck to see the extent to which that desire to foster spaces for dialogue, including on the future of the world trade system, is opening up, and where we're not only imagining the WTO as the only actor on world trade, and so real attention to a range of other international bodies, that some of the investment work is happening now at UNCITRAL, including on the facilitation framework, that we are dealing with the Inter-American Development Bank and its role in this, that UNCTAD is seeming more visible around much of this. I'm increasingly moving myself away from the spaghetti bowl analogy that, of course, has dominated so much of the way that we think about regionalism, and wanting to think more about the kind of tapestry that we want to be weaving together. So not a unitary vision of trade, but a vision that thinks about the relationship between multiple governance levels and a range of stakeholders who are not outsiders to trade, but really at its core. So taking the message of an inclusive, progressive trade agenda very seriously as a necessary way forward.
Thanks very much for that, Adelle. So thank you to you all for participating in this discussion, and thanks in particular to our panelists for bringing this conversation to you and opening a conversation about such an important issue of how trade, Indigenous people, gender, and labor can properly be addressed together. This is a very important question, as was evident from the questions that were posed in the room. The Sustainable Development Goals are really asking us to rewrite the future, and we have a very short time to do that, so this kind of conversation is really important. Thanks for joining us. Please give a big hand to the panelists.